in pursuit of health and wisdom. Sapio with Buck Joffrey.
Welcome back to Sapio. I am Buck Joffrey, and today I am going to talk to you about mitochondria. Okay, this is a topic that seems to be sort of like, I don't know, it's like the buzzword, right? I've never heard the word mitochondria so many times since I was in college myself studying molecular biology and cell and molecular physiology and these kinds of things. And next thing you know, I hear people talking about it left and right, and it's not scientists, not necessarily physicians or anything like that. It's usually internet influencers like Dave Asprey there or Gary Brecka, who, don't seem to quite understand necessarily what mitochondria are. So I thought I would do a little bit of a review and kind of talk about what mitochondria are, why are they important, that kind of thing, with a little bit of more scientific approach, instead of just pretending that mitochondria are some sort of thing that are out there that you can just heal or hack with a simple thing here and there by drinking some coffee or whatever. So mitochondria, as I said before, they aren't something you can necessarily just tweak with one pill or magically optimize in your life. And if that were true, we'd all be running marathons in our 90s and hundreds and all that. But the reality is it's much more complicated. And when it comes to these internet influencers, if you haven't figured out that I am very irritated by how much I hear about mitochondria from the likes of Gary Brecka, there's a saying, a little bit of knowledge is dangerous, right? And I think that is very true in this internet influencer space. And hopefully I can provide a little bit of the other end of that. So let's start out with, what are mitochondria? So mitochondria, they are often called the powerhouses of the cell, but that's a bit of an oversimplification. They do a lot more than just pump out energy. They are bean-shaped organelles, right? So like little organs within the cells. And they're responsible for oxidative phosphorylation. Now, before it gets too scary, remember, that's something I guarantee you, if you took high school biology, you studied oxidative phosphorylation. And you probably don't remember it, because why would you? But it is how we convert stuff we eat, like glucose, fats, proteins, into ATP, which you probably remember is the primary energy currency in our cells. ATP powers everything, whether that's muscle contraction to brain function, etc. So, but there's a lot more to mitochondria that people might not know. For example, they aren't spread equally throughout the body. In other words, you may not have the same amount in, one organ versus the other. Cells that usually need more energy, like the heart, the brain, the muscles, they contain thousands of mitochondria. For example, a single myocyte, which is a heart cell, can have up to, say, 5,000 mitochondria. And compare that to skin cells, which, as you can imagine, they don't do very much, so they don't need much energy, and you've got a vastly different mitochondrial load there. Mitochondria is a big deal for aging, though. If you listen to Aubrey de Grey, who is one of the pioneers in aging research, he's a guy I got a chance to interview him for Longevity Junkie, which, by the way, you should be listening to Longevity Junkie too. It's a great show. But he talks about it in terms of mitochondrial dysfunction as being one of the major hallmarks of aging. Over time, mitochondria accumulate damage from oxidative stress, right? And that makes them less efficient at producing energy and the way that we need them to, and they makes them more prone to releasing harmful byproducts. And that's where the trouble begins, okay? This brings us to what are known as reactive oxygen species, or ROS, okay? That is an important thing to remember. They're essentially molecular waste products produced during energy production. Now, a little bit of ROS may be potentially beneficial for signaling in the body, but too much can wreak havoc. Excessive reactive oxygen species damage mitochondrial DNA, proteins, and lipids, and contribute to the aging process and the onset of age-related disease. It's also important to remember that, so maybe we got to stop this reactive oxygen species. We're going to stop these things, and that solves the problem. Well, that's the problem there is the very activity that makes the mitochondria like essential, like the oxidative phosphorylation, it produces reactive oxidative species. So if the mitochondria are doing their job, they're going to produce these things that ultimately end up damaging their own DNA and leading to their own gradual demise. So that, my friends, is the paradox of mitochondria. What makes them, when they're working well, they're producing stuff that's going to damage themselves. Anyway, let's talk a little bit more about mitochondrial genetics. Mitochondrial DNA, it's actually different from the rest of your DNA. Unlike the DNA in the nucleus of your cells, right? The nucleus is, if you remember, like, you have a cell and you have like in basic biology, you think of the nucleus as like sort of the brain where all the, DNA and all that stuff is for the cells. Nuclear DNA is like the DNA you think of with all the chromosomes we have and so on. And unlike the DNA of the nucleus of your cells, which you inherit from both of your parents, mitochondrial DNA, which sticks with the mitochondria, comes exclusively from your mother. Yep, you get all of your mitochondrial genes from mom. And this inheritance pattern traces back to when mitochondria were once free-living bacteria that presumably became symbiotic with early eukaryotic cells of billions of years ago. Anyway, they still carry their own small circular genome, which is essential for mitochondrial function. So as I mentioned before, the mitochondria produces reactive oxygen species as byproducts of energy production, and you get damage to the mitochondrial DNA because of that. And over time, this leads to mutations in the mitochondrial DNA, and that, my friends, is, again, why, in part, we age. Damaged mitochondria means less efficient energy production, which leads to muscle weakness, neurodegeneration, and more. Now, the good news is that while somatic cells, meaning the cells that make up most of our body, accumulate this sort of mitochondrial DNA damage over a lifetime, this damage isn't passed on to your children because the mitochondria in your sperm or your eggs or whatever go through a vigorous process to prevent damaged mitochondrial DNA from being inherited. So that's why, even though you're getting this mitochondrial DNA from your mother straight down, and you ultimately have damaged mitochondrial DNA, it's the reason why mothers are not constantly passing down further and further damaged mitochondrial DNA to their offspring. And how does that happen? There's something called the mitochondrial bottleneck, if you're curious. During early egg development, only a small set of mitochondria are actually selected for replication, and this process kind of acts as a quality control system that ensures that only healthy mitochondria make it through to the next generation. Now let's get back to this idea that mitochondria are these, energy powerhouses. They have the oxidative phosphorylation. The very thing that they do, when they do it well, damages their own DNA. What makes mitochondria particularly vulnerable is the fact that their DNA is located so close to the site of oxidative phosphorylation, and that's where these reactive oxygen species are produced. That is the electron transport chain, if you remember that from basic biology. In addition to oxidative stress damaging your mitochondria, there are other factors, like environmental toxins, infections, poor lifestyle choices, smoking, excessive drinking, a sedentary lifestyle. Those can all, create damage as well. And certain medications, there's antibiotics like tetracyclines, chemotherapy, drugs like cisplatin. They're also notorious for impairing mitochondrial function, especially in high energy tissues like the heart and brain. Okay, so what can we do about this? As you can imagine, if the mitochondria are so important, mitochondrial DNA is a thing that sort of contributes to our aging, that there's lots of potential cutting-edge approaches that are being studied. So we can talk about some of that. Let's start with gene therapy and mitochondrial transfer. So gene therapy for mitochondrial dysfunction is all about introducing functional copies of mitochondrial genes into the nuclear DNA to bypass mitochondrial DNA. So again, let me restate that because it can get pretty confusing. Because remember, mitochondrial DNA is in the mitochondria, and it gets damaged very quickly because of the amount of reactive oxidative species within the mitochondria. However, if you can take that DNA and actually put it into the cell's nucleus where the rest of the DNA is, theoretically, you would be giving it some level of protection against those reactive oxidative species. So there is some research on this. Currently, there's people testing this in animal models and cell cultures, but it's not really something that's ready for human use right now. There's another idea. There's intercellular mitochondrial transfer, which is a phenomena where mitochondria actually move between cells through structures like tunneling nanotubes. And actually, it's been observed in certain conditions, like when cells are stressed or damaged, and healthy mitochondria are transferred to rescue impaired cells. So that naturally occurs in the body, which is, I thought, very interesting. That was something that I found. In other words, you can have cell-to-cell transfer of mitochondria. And there's even evidence that platelets can transfer mitochondria to other cells. So imagine using your own platelets to deliver healthy mitochondria to damaged tissues. And I know there's at least one lab that's trying to do that. What they do is you take your own platelets and what they try to do is try to divide your own platelets and then have a ton of them and then deliver them to yourself and try to get those mitochondria delivered to cells. We're not quite there on this whole thing. Who knows? I mean, you'll hear these companies talking like it's the next huge thing, but there's certainly potentials. As for drugs, let's talk a little bit about drugs. We talked about the things that various types of antibiotics and chemotherapeutics that can hurt your mitochondria, but there are also some out there that there's some evidence, certainly in animal models, that they can actually help with mitochondrial function. One of those is actually metformin, which you've heard me talk about before. It's a common diabetes medication. It's a medication that is used by a number of people in the longevity space, even if they don't have diabetes, because there is some suggestion that they may independently act as geroprotective agents, meaning that they actually lengthen life. There is a current study going on from Niels Barzilai. It's called a TAME study, so we'll find out if that is actually the case. But we do know mitochondria do benefit from metformin, and I think part of the idea there is that they help to kill off some of the weaker mitochondria and allow for newer ones to take their place. Rapamycin is another one that we've talked about several times on this show. It is probably the longevity drug with the greatest amount of evidence across species as a geroprotective agent, meaning, again, lengthening life agent, geroprotective. It has also shown a lot of potential for extending a lifespan by improving mitochondrial function. So the last thing I want to talk about is some real data that potentially is useful for you to decide on whether or not you want to take some supplements. From what I can find, really, there's a few different supplements that may have some real benefit for mitochondrial health. One of them is the coenzyme Q10. The reduced form, or the one that's much easily absorbed by your gut, is ubiquinol, and I actually take the ubiquinol myself. What the purpose of that is, it's basically a vital part of the electron transport chain. So if you remember, the mitochondria have that electron transport chain going on in there. It helps in the production of ATP, which is, again, the cell's energy currency. So what CoQ10 does is it kind of replaces some of that machinery. And so that's one of the things that it does. But it also acts as a pretty potent antioxidant, again, neutralizing some of those reactive oxygen species, as we talked about before, that oxidative stress. The other one that I knew less about, which I did find out a little bit about, which I think is interesting, might be something you might want to look into, is something called MitoQ. So this is a mitochondrial targeted form of CoQ10, and it's a modified version where there's a group like a lipophilic, meaning it can go through fat-soluble membranes, group that is attached to CoQ10 biochemically that allows it to cross the mitochondrial membrane more effectively. And once inside the mitochondria, MitoQ acts specifically to reduce oxidative damage by directly targeting and neutralizing reactive oxygen species. So this is interesting. I didn't know it. I'm actually going to try this out. The big difference between ubiquinol and MitoQ appears to be basically that ubiquinol isn't necessarily designed to deposit itself in the mitochondria. I mean, some of it gets in there, it's less specific, whereas the MitoQ actually gets in there, and its primary purpose is to accumulate in the mitochondria and to help neutralize some of those reactive oxygen species. The last supplement that I'll just mention here, you may have heard of urolithin A. You've probably heard a number of influencers talk about this, and I'm not sure exactly why. It's not that I don't think it's useful. It may be, but compared to, ubiquinol and MitoQ, it seems like kind of a tertiary type thing for mitochondrial health. There's one that a lot of influencers talk about, which is MitoPure. That is, again, urolithin A. It's a compound that's derived from pomegranate. And what it appears to do is to promote mitophagy, which is, as you probably can tell from the name, if you are in the space and you hear about autophagy, mitophagy is a process by which damaged mitochondria, again, are removed from the cell. So in that regards, it sounds a little bit like the same thing that metformin's doing. And so the idea is when you enhance mitophagy, you improve mitochondrial function, muscle health, and again, potentially benefit from the overall cellular health and longevity. The last thing I'm going to talk about, which I think you might find interesting, is as it relates to, the role of mitochondrial dysfunction in a couple of situations, again, I think are very useful to know about. One of them is, if you hear about people who have trouble with statins, I've talked about before that I think the net benefit of statins is significant. So I don't want to be one of those, influencers telling you to, not worry about your cholesterol and take statins and not take statins. Okay. But there is some studies that show that taking statins does seem to, in certain patients, seem to decrease mitochondrial function and cause some issues with mitochondrial dysfunction. And in those patients, the way they experience that is through muscle pain. One of the ways that you get around that is by supplementing with ubiquinol or CoQ10. So that is, I think that's something interesting to know on this topic. The other thing that I think is really interesting is that in patients with long COVID, it appears that there's really a couple of things there. It's a very complicated issue, but I think it seems like the doctors are really focusing on patients' treatment of this is to first treat the chronic low-grade inflammation. It's actually kind of surprising, but it seems like one of the drugs that's very useful there is Claritin, because it is a histamine blocker. So that's one of the things. But another thing that's often used are various types of CoQ10, because these patients who have long COVID appear to have a fair amount of mitochondrial dysfunction going on as well. So if you know anybody with long COVID, you may want to give them some of this information. Anyway, that's all I got this week. A little bit about mitochondria. Hopefully it helps you understand a little bit more when you hear influencers throwing around these words all the time. That's it for me this week on Sapio. This is Buck Joffrey signing off.
Thanks for listening to Sapio with Buck Joffrey. A quick reminder that while I am, in fact, a surgeon, nothing I say should be construed as medical advice. Now, make sure to include your physician in any medical decisions you make. And also, if you're enjoying the show, please make sure to show your support with a like, share, or subscribe. Until next time, this is Buck Joffrey for Sapio with Buck Joffrey.